What's fascinating to me about this passage of scriptures that we're looking at, where Paul is talking about the trap of money, one thing we know that Paul himself never lived in the lap of luxury, particularly after he became a Christian. He went from being a very wealthy, a very powerful, and very influential man to being a man who, as he said in his own words, I lost everything, including family and friends and position. And I'm sure that whatever inheritance and wealth that he had was probably taken from him as well. And he became, in many ways, a fugitive. In fact, where we find him for the next 11 years after his conversion is he's living in the city of Tarsus, where he was raised. And he's gone back to the family business, but not as the owner, but rather he's a tent maker. And most tent makers made tents for the Roman military. That primarily they're basically a military contractor. But it was just hard, arduous work. They took skins and they trimmed them and they sewed them by hand in a particular way to make a good product. And he did that for a long season, all at the same time, busily ministering and sharing the Gospels. And it was some years afterwards that he was finally found faithful enough in the Lord to be able to for Barnabas went to Tarsus and found him, brought him to Antioch to help him disciple the many Gentile new believers that were getting saved left and right. And so it's really kind of a profound story. And so that Paul is a guy who had a lot, and he became a guy who really had nothing in particular. And in many of his mission journeys, he was supported by others. The church in Philippi was very generous and faithful to him, whereas the church in Corinth, he made a point not to take money from them, because they had a lot of people showing up who, these various prophets and philosophers and others, who did what they did, kind of like some of these TV evangelists do, just simply to try and make money. And Paul did not want to be counted as them. He did not want them to think that he was after their money. Paul, in fact, said to the Corinthians, I want you to know that I want you, not yours. In other words, I want your souls. I don't want your money. It was a very, very important book. So 2 Corinthians, in fact, is a great book to really get a sense of Paul's feelings about money and the role it plays in the life of the church and so forth. But he had this one warning that really has become, basically it's kind of like a philosophy, an adage that every culture recognizes. He said in verse 10, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Now, we really have to get down and define what does the love of money mean, and we go back to the original languages. What it means is having an affection for silver, literally. You have this fond affection for silver. And I remember reading one time, a gentleman was telling me that his uncle, who was a very wealthy man, back in the days when coins were worth something, would on a regular basis go and take a bunch of coins from the bank, put them in his pockets, and he would walk down the street and just drop them on the street. And he said the reason he did that was to remind himself that money was something that would fly away, and he shouldn't do what he did for money. So as he became prosperous, what he was most concerned was, I would fall in love with the prosperity. And I think that's a reality. I find that my wife and I were talking about how when we were first married and we would go on trips, we didn't have any money to go on a vacation, so we'd often go to our families' homes because they had nice homes with swimming pools and things like that. And we would, they would watch the kids, and my wife and I could play for a couple of weeks. And oftentimes I would have to take a job. I'd go back to one of my old employers and I would work for him for a week so that we could have money to take the kids to Disneyland or some other thing that they would have fun with. And we were pretty thrilled. We were poor, but we didn't realize how poor we were. We were just very thankful that God would provide for us and take care of us. But it's interesting because we were talking about now how that when we're on the highway, if we're going traveling across country and we look at some hotels, we're checking all the ratings. We want to make sure that it's up to a certain level because we can afford to pay for a better hotel than we used to pay for. And I think about some of the flea bag places we stayed with. Yeesh. But nonetheless, now we have a choice. And the point is, what would I do if I couldn't do that? And I remember how that really hit me when we started doing mission work overseas in places like India or Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed. And so many of the places that we were staying in were really, to say that they were shabby would be a compliment. They were really kind of old and worn out and dirty and not clean and all that kind of stuff. And I had somebody one time ask me, said, well, having these conditions being so hard, why do you go back? And I said, it's worth putting up with because I love to share the gospel with these people and see how Christ transforms their life. I mean, I would, just come in these countries and I just take a deep breath and go, okay, I can endure this for a week or 2 weeks. But then when you start sharing and ministering the gospel, there was just something in your heart that just said, this is worth enduring. I'm willing to do this. And those kind of experiences and tests in your life are really, really important, because when we begin to say there are things that I would never do, then we're beginning to put limitations on what God might want to do and the opportunities he might want to give you. And I just think that we need to just be willing to say, God, if this is what you have for me, then your will be done and your kingdom come. Because I've just found that God is faithful, and if he wants to have something better, he will do that. I find because I fly a lot, it's always this hope that I'm going to get an upgrade just because I have such status with the airline. And, it's just a wonderful feeling when they come up to you and say, here, we've upgraded your seat to first class. And I just simply say, thank you, Jesus. I praise your holy name for that. And because it's obviously, I don't want to lie to you, it is nicer in first class. It's more comfortable. You got more leg room. The seats are wider. The snacks are better. They treat you like a human being. But when it doesn't happen, you're just simply saying, God, that's fine. It reminds me that I'm not better than anybody else. I'm just one of the guys. My wife says, you share too much sometimes. Yeah, probably it. But I don't know. It's who I am. I just want to be truthful about them. But then one of the things he said is the love of money is really the thing that leads to a whole lot of other things. Because I like the image that he says it's a root of all kinds of evil. The thing about a root is you don't see it. And a root grows and goes deeper and deeper long before you recognize that a plant is next going to appear. So when the sprout appears, one thing we all know from grade school by planting in a plastic cup, that those roots begin to penetrate, and until that root is developed, the sprout cannot sustain. And the bigger the plant, the stronger, the deeper, the wider the root is. And so he says, basically, it's kind of a way of saying that when you have a love of money, it may not be obvious to you or other people, but over time, something has begun to grow up. And what you're going to find is to grow up is a kind of an evil in your life. You're going to find that your joys begin to diminish, your peace is going to go away, that you find yourself immersed in conflicts and fighting over stuff that doesn't matter. And that's why he goes on to say that some people who are eager for money have wandered from the faith. In other words, I don't want to trust God. I want to trust in my bank account, which in this day and age is a pretty foolish thing since, I'll just say it, that our banks are not stable despite what they tell us, and they'll probably be soon going through major changes. But he said what happens is you wander from the faith. It isn't like you turn your back on God. You just kind of find yourself drifting away, and one day you wake up someplace else. You find that instead of trusting God, you're grinding and groping and grasping to hold on to what you have and to hopefully gain more, so that when the interest rates go up and the stock that you invested drops and its value is depreciated, you go into a grand funk and a deep depression. And we overlook the words of Job, who went through that kind of economic depression. And he said, we might say economic bankruptcy. He went through every kind of bankruptcy, bottom line. And he said, blessed is the name of the Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And that's even where Job says, even if he kills me, I'll praise him. Well, I find that I end up praising him, but oftentimes not immediately. When things go really sour, I can get depressed, I can get discouraged, I can get angry, I can sit there and machinate in my mind how I'm going to fix or do this and adjust that and make this happen. But at some point, until I step back and say, Lord, your will be done, your kingdom come. You give and you take away. Because he says if you don't do that, you'll end up piercing yourself through with many griefs. I had a friend of mine years ago who inherited a significant lot of money back in the early 70s. I mean, he inherited $120,000, which today would be like inheriting $1 million. I mean, to me at that time was like an unbelievable amount of money. And he started buying just about every toy that you could imagine. And I remember over the process of time, his marriage fell apart. He lost his family, lost his ministry, he lost all sorts of things. And he eventually had to sell a lot of his toys because he couldn't afford them anymore. And he told me one day, he said, the worst thing that ever happened to me was that money, because he says, now I am pierced through with many griefs. I'm pierced through with sorrows. And that was such a profound message, that if his hardship was only to help me hear those words from somebody who knew what he was talking about, who had been there, it was worth it to me. I felt sorry for him. And he was able eventually to rebuild his life on a solider foundation. But nonetheless, I've just seen it's so very, very true. Well, we've got one more to do, one more passage I want to cover before we bring it to a close at the end of this week. God bless you, and go in his wondrous grace.